had been planning the camping trip for a couple of months. I'd wanted something quiet and away from people for a while. Work had burned me out, and I needed to step away from screens, meetings, and phones. I picked a national forest that didn't get much foot traffic and was about a 6-hour drive from the city. I packed the basics: tent, food, water, some simple tools, and a small burner. I wasn't planning to hike far in, just far enough to be away from the roads and any other campers who might be nearby. I arrived just before sunset. The trailhead was empty, which was exactly what I'd hoped for. The air was cool and dry, and the pine trees lining the lot gave off that rich, sharp scent I'd missed. I took a small trail about a mile in and found a clearing just large enough for my small tent and a fire pit. I didn't plan on using a fire, but I liked that someone had camped there before. It felt like a subtle sign that it was a safe spot. I set up the tent quickly. My gear was lightweight and minimal. After everything was in place, I ate some canned chili, read a few pages from a paperback I brought, and listened to the wind pushing gently through the trees. There were no unnatural sounds. It felt clean and untouched, like the world had reset. The first night was calm. I slept well, only waking a couple of times from the sounds of branches snapping somewhere far off. I assumed it was a raccoon or maybe a deer. My food was packed up in the bear canister and placed far from my tent. I felt good. I fell back asleep easily. The next day, I hiked around the area without straying too far from camp. I found a stream about 15 minutes downhill and filled my water bottles using the filter. I saw no other people. I went back to camp, ate again, and laid in the tent for a bit. It was early evening when I heard the truck. It was faint at first, just a low rumble in the distance. Then the sound got closer. I stood up and walked to the edge of the clearing. I could see the top of the ridgeline through the trees. A lifted pickup truck appeared and slowly rolled into view along the dirt access road that must have been out of use for years. The truck was covered in dust and had a rack of lights along the roof, but none were on. It stopped for a minute, maybe 200 feet from where I was, just beyond the treeline. I didn't move. The windows were tinted too dark to see anything inside. Then it drove off. I watched it until it was out of sight. It didn't make sense. That road wasn't on any of the maps I'd looked at, and it didn't lead to any trailhead or campsite I knew of. I tried to brush it off. Maybe they were hunters scouting an area. Maybe they were just exploring. Either way, I didn't see the truck again that night. The second night was different. I woke up around 3 a.m. and instantly knew something was wrong. It wasn't a sound that woke me. It was the feeling of being watched. I laid still for a long time, barely breathing. Eventually, I sat up slowly and unzipped the tent flap a few inches. Nothing, just trees. The moonlight was enough to see the shape of my bear canister and the slope of the land beyond. I looked left. I looked right. Then I saw it. On the trail that led out from the clearing, there were footprints. Fresh ones. The ground was dry but soft enough to catch clear outlines. I counted at least 4 different prints. Heavy boot prints and some smaller ones. I never heard anyone approach. No voices, nothing else. I got out of the tent, scanned the area quickly, and didn't see anyone. I walked the perimeter quietly. The prints didn't return, they only came in. I didn't sleep again that night. I stayed awake until the sun came up. When it did, I packed up everything. I didn't want to run, but I wanted to be ready if I had to. I wasn't going to leave just yet. I told myself it could have been other campers passing through. I had no real reason to assume anything bad had happened. Later that morning, I heard the truck again. This time it was closer. I stepped off the trail and waited behind a tree. The truck drove slowly through the trees and stopped right at the clearing. 2 men got out. They were dressed in work clothes, jeans, boots, flannel shirts. One of them looked around while the other walked up to where I'd set up my tent. He crouched down and studied the dirt, right where my tent had been. I didn't move. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure they could hear it. They didn't find me. After about 10 minutes, they got back in the truck and left. I waited another 20 minutes before coming back to the site. I walked in a wide arc, checking for anything else. Nothing. It was time to go. I packed everything and hiked back to the trailhead quickly. On the way, I kept looking over my shoulder. I didn't feel safe until I saw my car again. I got in, locked the doors, and just sat there. That's when the truck came back. It drove past the trailhead slowly. One of the men was driving. The other leaned out the window slightly, like he was looking at cars. They passed me without stopping. I didn't wait. I started my car and drove the opposite direction, out to the main highway. I drove for about an hour, stopped at a small gas station, and just sat there again. Something wasn't right. I couldn't get rid of the feeling. Then I thought about it more clearly. I didn't think about this until I left their truck and got back to my camp. Their truck whizzed past me, and I immediately was struck with fear that a third party had taken them while they distracted me. I ran to the tent. The gear was gone. All of it. Tent, sleeping bag, food, bear canister. The only things left were my footprints and a few wrappers I'd buried under a rock the day before. There were more boot prints than I remembered. It hit me like a wave. The truck guys weren't the threat, or at least not the only one. Someone else had come into my camp when I left to follow the truck. Maybe they had been watching. Maybe the truck was their way of getting me to leave the site. Maybe they worked together, or maybe the truck guys were just unlucky. I looked around the tree line, knowing how pointless it was. Whoever it was had been smart, quiet, careful. I hiked back to the car again, this time with nothing. The rest of the trip was over. I drove straight home. I didn't stop except for gas. I barely slept for the next few nights. I kept the lights on. Every small noise made me jump. Over time, I got rid of most of my camping gear. I still go hiking sometimes, but never alone. And I never camp far from my car. It still bothers me that I'll never know who was in those woods, or what they really wanted. But I know what I felt. It wasn't curiosity. It was fear, pure bone-deep fear. And I trust that feeling more than anything else now. I don't blame you for running, and I mean that. But looking back, I wish someone had thought harder about what the other person said. The bit about a third party, that little warning, it should have made me think twice. But it didn't, and now I live with that weight every day. God, this world is kind of fucked. It all started with a trip I took last summer. I was trying to unplug for a while. Get off the grid. No phone, no emails, no noise. I packed up my gear, filled the cooler with a week's worth of food and drinks, and headed out to a forested area about 4 hours from the city. It wasn't some state park or heavily trafficked campground. This was a spot I had found years ago while hunting. A clearing deep in the woods, near a creek, isolated and peaceful. It had taken years for me to get comfortable camping out there alone. At first, every branch snap or squirrel rustle would get my blood moving. But after a while, you adjust. You begin to trust that what's out there is mostly just trees and bugs. I had a routine. I set up my tent in the same spot every time, cleared the fire ring, stacked some wood, and kept my gear clean and in order. This time was no different. The first couple of days were uneventful. I fished in the creek, hiked around to keep my legs loose, kept a journal, and spent a lot of time just sitting in silence. The quiet really does reset your brain. By day 3, I felt like I was finally getting into that calm rhythm I'd come out there for. Then that evening, as I was roasting a small trout over the fire, I heard a vehicle. I wasn't expecting that. The sound of tires on dirt wasn't normal this far back, especially not near my spot. It was a low rumble, and I could hear it for a while before I saw anything. My sight was just out of view of the nearest dirt road, so I had to walk a bit uphill to get a look. I saw a dark green pickup parked along the edge of the road, maybe 40 yards from my sight. 2 people were standing outside it, a man and a woman, both in their mid-30s, I'd guess. They were just standing there, looking around, not doing anything that odd, but something about it rubbed me wrong. Their truck doors were open, and one of them kept glancing around like they were expecting someone. I didn't approach right away. I watched them for a bit. Then I made some noise as I walked up so I wouldn't startle them. I figured maybe they got lost or something. When I got close enough, I waved. They waved back. We stood there for a minute in that awkward silence you get when no one really knows what the other is doing. They didn't seem dangerous. Worn hiking boots, a backpack, a tarp in the truck bed. Looked like fellow campers, honestly. But something still didn't sit right. I I remember how clean the inside of their truck looked, not like a vehicle that had been on dusty logging roads for days. They made small gestures, smiled a bit, pointed like they were asking about the creek. I nodded, pointed back toward my camp, and then left them there. I figured they were just scouting a place to camp for the night. But after I got back to my fire, the thought came back to me. Something someone once said online about a third party, about how the real danger isn't the obvious ones in front of you, but the person you're not seeing. The one using the first two to get your guard down. I hadn't thought much about it when I read it. I think it was in a post about carjackings or abductions or something, but now it was circling in my head. I felt uneasy again, that old, first-time camping alone feeling. I kept turning it over. What if those two were just there to distract me? What if someone else had slipped into the woods while I was standing there with them? I jumped to my feet and started back toward my tent. I didn't even douse the fire. I moved quick, not running, but close to it. I kept looking around, listening hard. Everything was too quiet. I got to my site and scanned it from the edge. My gear looked untouched. Tent zippered, cooler where I left it. Nothing looked out of place. Still, I approached cautiously, crouched, heart pounding. I yanked the tent open. Empty. I checked the cooler, still full. No footprints I hadn't made. Nothing. But it didn't ease me, because if someone had slipped into the woods while I was distracted, they didn't need to mess with anything. Just watch. Just wait. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat with my back against a tree, knife in hand, staring out into the woods. I kept my headlamp off, eyes adjusted to the dark. Every snap or rustle made my skin crawl. I didn't see the green truck again, didn't hear it drive off. I don't know when they left. By morning, I was a wreck. I ate a protein bar, packed my gear fast and sloppy, and started back down the trail to my truck. The whole way I felt watched, like eyes were behind every tree. I didn't stop for brakes, just pushed until I saw the gravel road and the glint of my windshield through the trees. The truck was untouched. No signs anyone had been near it. I climbed in, locked the doors, and just sat there for a while, breathing, thinking, and that's when the fear shifted again. What if the danger hadn't been out there in the trees, but somewhere else entirely? What if they had scoped me out long before I saw them, found me online, watched me drive in? I drove home without stopping, made it back in time for dinner but didn't eat. I sat in my apartment with the lights off, thinking about the two people by that green truck, the warning about a third party, and how close I might have been to something I couldn't even define. In the days that followed, I kept checking news reports, missing persons lists, forums, anything to see if someone else had seen them or if anything bad had happened in that area. Nothing. No leads. Just silence. I haven't been back to that spot since. I haven't gone solo camping at all. I still think about that moment, how I brushed off the warning until I was alone again. How that world I thought was peaceful and healing could hold something so cold and calculating. The scariest part wasn't what happened. It was what could have happened. The unknown. The possibility that someone, maybe more than one, had me on their list, and I slipped through because I listened to a whisper of a warning just in time. The worst things aren't loud. They're subtle. They don't scream. They wait. And when they move, they do it in a way you don't notice until it's too late. That's what stays with me. That someone somewhere might still be out there, planning, waiting for the next person who doesn't think about the third party. I've always been the type to over-prepare. When it comes to camping, I pack like I'm going on an expedition, even if I'm only going for 2 nights. I like things to be organized and accounted for: extra batteries, backup maps, 2 first aid kits, more food and water than I could ever need. I plan for rain even if the forecast is sunny, and I bring layers like I'm headed to the Arctic even if it's July. I think part of that comes from growing up watching survival shows and listening to stories of things going wrong. I never wanted to be the person who looked back and said, I should have brought that. So when I took a weekend camping trip alone into a remote part of a state forest in late September, I felt pretty confident I'd covered all my bases. The plan was to hike about 5 miles into a lesser-used trail loop and set up camp near a stream that fed into a small lake. I'd been there once before with a group, but this was my first solo trip to the spot. It was quiet, peaceful, and deep enough in the woods that I knew I wouldn't be disturbed by anyone. I checked in at the ranger station, signed the log, and gave them my intended route and return time. They appreciated that. Most people didn't bother. The ranger, an older guy with a sun-scarred face, nodded and scribbled something down. He glanced over my gear and gave me a quick thumbs up. I didn't think much of it. By the time I hit the trailhead, it was nearly 10 a.m. The hike was uneventful. The air was crisp, but not cold. The leaves had just started to change, so the forest had that mixed green and orange look that made everything feel alive. I moved at a steady pace, not rushing, taking in the small sounds, birds flitting in the trees, the crunch of dry leaves under my boots, the distant murmur of water once I got closer to the stream. I reached the campsite a little after noon and got to work setting up my tent. There was a flat patch of ground between two large pines that was perfect for pitching the tent. I cleared it, set up the shelter, and got my cooking area organized about 20 yards away. I even hung my bear bag early, looping the rope between two high branches and pulling it tight. I had no cell signal out there, which was expected, so I shut my phone off to save battery and clipped it to the inside of my pack. By 3 in the afternoon, I had eaten, filtered more water from the stream, and was kicking back in a camp chair I brought, just watching the breeze move through the canopy. It was a normal day, uneventful, relaxing even, the kind of quiet where your thoughts go soft and the world around you feels almost like a memory. I read a bit from a book I brought, walked around the lake, and kept my eyes open for animal tracks. I saw a few deer, raccoon, maybe a coyote. Nothing fresh, nothing threatening. I didn't see another person all day, just trees and water and sky. That night, I built a fire as the light faded. It wasn't cold enough to need one, but there's something about a fire that keeps you grounded when you're alone in the woods. It gives you a kind of purpose, something to look at, something to listen to besides your own breathing. I roasted a bit of sausage, made tea, and sat for hours just staring at the flames. When the fire burned down, I doused it properly, cleaned up, and crawled into my sleeping bag inside the tent. The first night passed without incident. I heard some movement in the underbrush at one point, probably a raccoon, but it never got close. I stayed zipped up, headlamp within reach, and drifted off again. The air got colder overnight, but nothing serious. Just enough to make me grateful for the liner inside my sleeping bag. I woke up the next morning a little stiff but rested. Brewed coffee, ate oatmeal, and planned to hike around the other side of the lake. Maybe fish a little, and then come back to camp to cook dinner early and enjoy another quiet night. Around noon, I was coming back from my loop around the lake when I noticed something strange near the edge of the water, not far from where I filtered water the day before. It looked like a pile of moss or grass had been turned up. It wasn't that odd on its own. Animals dig around all the time, but something about the way the soil was disturbed felt off. Not a dig exactly, more like something had been pressed into the ground. I bent down to look closer. The impression wasn't a paw print, not from anything I could recognize. It was long and smooth, maybe a boot, but no treads, just an oblong dent, like something cylindrical had been placed there and removed. I scanned the area and didn't see any other marks. No trash, no broken branches, just that weird single impression near the water. Stuck in my head for a while, but I brushed it off. Maybe it had been there the whole time and I just didn't notice it yesterday. Or maybe it was some kind of natural thing, an animal laying down or a tree limb falling and then being moved. I kept going. That evening, as I was cooking rice and dried vegetables near the fire pit, I started hearing faint rustling again. It was just past 6, still plenty of daylight. The rustling wasn't rhythmic, not like wind. It was soft but deliberate, something shifting weight, stopping, then moving again. I stood up slowly and scanned the woods. I didn't see anything, no movement, but I could hear it. I stopped stirring the food and listened closely. It was coming from the direction of the lake. Not the path I had just come from, but directly through the thick trees along the shore. The kind of dense growth that people don't usually walk through unless they really have to. The rustling stopped after a few minutes. I told myself it was a deer or a raccoon again, maybe something rooting for food. Still, I ate fast that night. My nerves were up a bit. I doused the fire early, checked my gear, made sure everything was tied and zipped and put away, then climbed into my tent just as the light started to fade. That night, I had a harder time sleeping. The forest around me felt different. Not louder, just tuned differently, like something had changed. At one point, around midnight, I heard a very clear snap, not far away, like a branch breaking under weight. Then silence. Not a single insect sound after that. It stayed dead quiet for nearly an hour. I lay perfectly still, ears straining, heartbeat in my throat. Nothing else happened. Eventually, some normal night sounds came back, and I must have fallen asleep again. The next morning was colder. I woke up early, feeling a little uneasy, but again, I brushed it off. I had one more night planned, but part of me wanted to pack up early. I ate a fast breakfast and walked a mile up the trail to get a better view from a ridge. When I came back to camp, something was off. I knew it before I even reached the clearing. It was too quiet again. That deep kind of silence you only notice when it happens twice. Then I saw it. The bear bag rope had been cut. Not torn, not chewed, cut. Clean. The bag itself was gone. I stood frozen for several seconds, looking up at the empty branch where the bag had been hanging. The rope dangled like a snapped wire. I checked around the base of the tree, hoping maybe it had fallen, but I didn't see the bag anywhere. No trash, no claw marks, just the missing food and the rope hanging loose. That was the moment things shifted for me. It wasn't just animals anymore. Someone had been in my camp. I spun around, scanning the treeline. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. My instincts kicked in. I grabbed my pack, stuffed it with the basics: first aid, knife, headlamp, map, GPS unit, and some emergency food from my internal stash. I left the tent as it was and started moving fast down the trail toward the ranger station. I didn't run, but I walked with purpose, eyes scanning everything. About half a mile down the trail, I saw it again. Another weird impression in the dirt. Not a print, just that same smooth, oblong dent, like someone had laid something heavy down and picked it up again. No drag marks, no footprints, just a dent. I kept going. I made it back to the ranger station just after noon. When I explained what happened, the ranger's face changed. He didn't say much, just asked for details, took notes, and thanked me for coming in early. He didn't act surprised. That stuck with me. Later, after I got home, I did some digging, quietly. Turns out there had been some strange reports in that area. Not attacks, not crimes, just odd things. Campers finding their gear disturbed, food gone, firewood rearranged. Once, a tent was found relocated 30 feet from where it had been set up. No one ever saw anyone. No one got hurt, so the stories never made it past local forums. The impression in the dirt? I showed a friend of mine who works in forestry. He said it looked like the kind of mark a large gas cylinder might make, or a sealed metal canister. Not something you'd expect to find in the middle of the woods. We both agreed whatever it wasn't left there by accident. Looking back, I'm glad I trusted my gut. I don't know who or what was out there with me that weekend, but someone had eyes on my camp. Someone had a knife. Someone took the time to move through the woods quietly, cut a rope without leaving footprints, and disappear without a sound. I wouldn't have even thought to worry about something like that. Someone watching, staying just out of sight, leaving no prints, no sounds. I've always been someone who enjoys getting away from everything, particularly the buzz of city life. Nature has always been a place where I could disconnect, find some peace, and truly clear my head. That's how I found myself in the middle of nowhere one weekend, deep in a remote part of the Sierra Nevada, camping by a quiet, forgotten creek. It was just me this time, no friends, no distractions. I wanted solitude. I wanted to spend some time alone in nature, to center myself. Little did I know, the solitude I was searching for would end up being the most unsettling experience of my life. I've done a fair share of camping in my life, but this was different. Most of the time, when I go camping, I choose places that are fairly well known, even if they're off the beaten path. But this spot was remote, far from any hiking trails or common campsites. The only sounds I could hear were the occasional birds, the rustling of leaves in the wind, and the gurgle of the creek nearby. It was peaceful in a way that almost felt unnatural. There was an eerie stillness to it, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I arrived around noon, after a couple of hours of winding roads and a rough hike. The site was tucked into a small clearing surrounded by dense trees. A perfect spot, with the creek running quietly nearby and a perfect little clearing for a fire. I set up my tent, unpacked my gear, and got to work making camp. The air was cool, the kind of crispness that you can only get in the mountains. Everything felt right, everything felt normal. The first night passed without incident. I built a fire, cooked some simple food, and sat back to enjoy the quiet. It was one of those nights where everything felt just right. The stars overhead, the crackling fire, the sense of being completely alone. There was nothing disturbing about it. I went to bed that night feeling at ease, something I hadn't felt in a while. I had spent years in nature and never had an experience that unsettled me, until the next morning. I woke up early the next day, just as the sun was beginning to peek through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Something felt off, though. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but there was an odd tension in the air. The usual sounds of the forest, the chirps of birds and the rustling of the wind, were absent. It was dead silent, save for the soft trickle of the creek. I shook off the unease, figuring it was just the early morning quiet. Maybe I was just being overly sensitive. But as I started my coffee and watched the fog lift from the creek, I began to feel that odd sensation of being watched. I looked around but saw nothing, just trees and the trickling water. I felt a cold sweat start to form on the back of my neck, though, that deep, instinctive feeling that something wasn't quite right. I decided to shake it off, grab my gear, and take a short hike. There were some hills a couple miles away that I had seen on the map, and I figured a walk would help me clear my head. But as I stepped out of camp and into the woods, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe the quiet had gotten to me. But the further I walked, the more I started to feel like something was following me. It wasn't like the sound of footsteps behind me. It was more like the subtle crack of twigs just a little too far away for me to catch with my eyes. The rustle of leaves off to my left when I was sure there was nothing there. I stopped for a moment and scanned the trees, but there was nothing. No movement, no creatures, just the oppressive silence. I turned back toward camp, hoping that maybe a bit of time sitting by the fire would calm me down. But the unease stuck with me. It was like something was hanging in the air, some kind of tension I couldn't shake. When I got back to camp, I decided to do a little work, chopping some firewood and preparing for the night. It wasn't long before I started hearing it. A soft, almost indistinct sound coming from the trees near the creek. I stopped, trying to listen more carefully, but it was gone just as quickly as it came. I chalked it up to wind, or maybe a small animal moving through the underbrush. I didn't want to let my mind get carried away, but the sound had made me feel uneasy again. As the day wore on, the strange feeling of being followed intensified. I kept catching glimpses of movement in the trees, just outside my peripheral vision. Each time, when I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. It was maddening. By evening, I was starting to feel seriously uneasy. I made sure to keep the fire nice and high, hoping the light would chase away whatever was lurking in the shadows. But it didn't help. If anything, the shadows seemed to grow longer, more oppressive, as the night descended. It was around 9:30 p.m. when things started to get really strange. I had been sitting by the fire for a while, occasionally glancing out into the darkness of the trees. The silence was nearly complete now, with only the occasional crackle from the fire and the distant sound of the creek. That's when I heard it again, movement. This time, it wasn't distant. It was much closer, just beyond the reach of the firelight. I froze, listening intently. The sound was soft, slow, like someone or something was creeping through the underbrush. My heart began to race, and my eyes darted toward the noise. But I saw nothing. Then I heard it, a whisper. It was so faint I almost thought I imagined it. but it was there, a soft murmur coming from just outside the light of the fire. A few seconds later, I heard it again, closer this time, but it wasn't a voice. It was breathing, heavy, slow breathing, like something was close and watching me. I reached for my rifle, fingers trembling, but my mind was racing faster than my hands could move. The thoughts came crashing down on me. I wasn't alone out here. Something had been watching me all day, and it was finally getting closer. I stood up and backed into the center of the camp, keeping the fire between myself and the trees. The breathing continued, low and steady, but I couldn't see a thing. I was scanning the trees as best I could, but everything was just blackness beyond the reach of the fire. Then it came, a shape moving at the edge of the firelight. It was too fast to be a human. It was something else. I couldn't see it clearly, but it was big. Big enough to be a bear, but the way it moved was wrong. Too fast, too unnatural. I snapped my rifle up, heart pounding, but I hesitated. What if it was just a bear, a deer, or some other animal? What if I was overreacting? The decision came for me when the thing lunged from the shadows. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a deer. It was a blur of dark movement, quick and powerful. But it didn't attack me. It ran past, too fast for me to get a clear shot, disappearing into the forest. I stood frozen, my rifle still aimed in the direction it had gone. But it was gone. Just like that. I didn't hear it anymore. The breathing had stopped. The silence returned. I sat down heavily, my hands shaking, my breath ragged. I didn't know what I had just seen, but I knew it wasn't right. Whatever it was fast, intelligent, and it was stalking me. I spent the rest of the night huddled by the fire, watching the tree lean, afraid to move. I barely slept. Every rustle in the leaves made me jump. I kept hearing soft, slow breathing in the wind, but when I looked, there was nothing there. The next morning, I packed up and left before the sun was even fully up. I didn't want to be there another minute. I didn't care that I hadn't finished my trip or that I was abandoning the campsite. It was too much. The quiet, the feeling of being followed, the dark shape that had moved in the trees. I didn't need to know what it was. I just knew I wasn't staying another night to find out. I don't know what I saw that night, but it was something that didn't belong there. Something that wasn't natural. And whatever it was watching me. It wasn't a ghost or a creature from some fairy tale. It was something real. Something that I don't ever want to encounter again. I haven't been back to that area since. It still haunts me, the feeling of being stalked, the feeling that something was out there, just waiting for me to let my guard down. Whatever it was, I'm certain it's still out there, and I have no intention of finding out what it wants. When I think back to that trip, it's not the trees or the trails or even the quiet that stands out in my mind. It's the feeling, that sense of knowing something wasn't right, that strange mix of responsibility and fear that you can't shake, even long after the moment has passed. I was 12 years old, and it was the first time I really felt the weight of being older, of being the one in charge, even if only for a few hours. My parents were the kind of people who loved the outdoors. Every summer, like clockwork, we'd pack up the car with gear and food and hit the road toward whatever new campground they'd found in the guidebooks. My little brother, Josh, was 8 then. He didn't care much about nature, but he liked the idea of roasting marshmallows and sleeping in a tent. I liked reading by the lake, feeling the wind on my face, the sun warming my arms. At least I used to. That summer, my parents picked a place up north, somewhere in the Upper Peninsula. I don't remember the exact name of the campground, but it wasn't a national park or anything well known. It was one of those smaller, lesser used areas where you had to drive on a gravel road for 15 minutes just to reach the entrance. There were no rangers posted there full time, just a self-pay station and some laminated maps pinned to a board. It was beautiful in a quiet way. Dense pine trees, thick underbrush, and a small lake that didn't seem to have a name. The air smelled clean, a mix of moss and sap and water. We set up our tent in a spot that backed into the woods, with only one other campsite in view, maybe 100 yards away through the trees. That one was empty the entire time we were there. The first 2 days were fine, peaceful. We fished, We hiked. My dad cooked over the fire, and we'd fall asleep to the sound of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. We didn't see anyone else during that time. Not a single car came down the road. It was like we had the whole place to ourselves. On the third day, my parents decided they wanted to hike a loop trail that circled the lake and went up into the hills a bit. It was about 7 miles long, which didn't sound too bad to me, but Josh had gotten a blister on his heel the day before and didn't want to go. He whined about it all morning. Eventually, they gave up trying to convince him, and I volunteered to stay back with him. I wasn't thrilled about it, but I figured it would be an easy day. Some cards, some snacks, maybe reading. Before they left, my mom made sure we had everything we needed. Food, water, the emergency whistle, even the bear spray, which I thought was overkill, considering we hadn't seen any wildlife bigger than a chipmunk. They told us they'd be back by late afternoon. After they walked off, everything got quiet again. I sat at the picnic table while Josh played with sticks near the fire ring. We had peanut butter sandwiches for lunch, then spent an hour drawing in our sketchbooks. Around 1 in the afternoon, I heard something in the woods, like a crunch of twigs underfoot. My heart jumped a little, but I told myself it was a deer or maybe a squirrel. Josh heard it too. He looked at me, eyes a little wide, and I told him it was nothing, just an animal. Still, I stood up and peered into the trees. I didn't see anything, but the feeling it left behind didn't go away. We moved into the tent for a bit after that. I figured we'd be safer in there if anything bigger wandered into camp. The tent walls were thin, obviously, but somehow being inside made it easier to pretend everything was normal. An hour passed, then another. Started to cloud up, the way it does before an afternoon storm. The wind picked up, and I kept checking my watch, wondering when Mom and Dad would get back. I wasn't worried yet, just anxious. I told myself the trail probably took longer than expected. Maybe they stopped to take pictures or rest. Then we heard that sound again, crunching, this time closer. It came from behind the tent, just past where we'd stacked some firewood. I held my breath. Josh froze too, clutching his sketchbook like a shield. I leaned forward and unzipped the corner of the tent, just enough to peek through. There was a person, a man, not my dad. He was standing maybe 15 feet from the tent, half hidden behind a tree, like he'd been trying to sneak up on us and got caught. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there. But something about him felt wrong. His clothes looked dirty, his hair was matted, and he wasn't carrying a pack or gear or anything you'd expect someone to have if they were hiking or camping. He stared at the tent for a few seconds longer, then turned and walked back into the woods. I didn't move for a long time after that. Neither did Josh. I think we both knew, without saying it, that something about that man wasn't okay. I finally pulled out the emergency whistle and blew it. 3 sharp blasts, the signal for help. No answer, just trees and wind and silence. The rest of the day dragged on in a kind of slow-motion panic. I kept looking out through the mesh, scanning the woods for any sign of movement. Josh stayed glued to my side. At some point, I realized we hadn't heard a single bird call in over an hour. Even the squirrels were gone. It got dark, and our parents still hadn't returned. That's when the rain started. At first, it was just a drizzle. Then it picked up, heavy drops pounding the nylon of the tent. The wind pushed hard against the sides, and I could hear branches creaking overhead. I wanted to cry, but I couldn't, not in front of Josh. I told him we'd be fine, that Mom and Dad probably took shelter somewhere along the trail and would be back as soon as the storm passed. But even I didn't believe that. Something was off, way off. Then, sometime just after sunset, we heard movement again. Not just one step or two, but slow, deliberate crunches closer than before. I reached for the bear spray and held it tight in my hand. Josh grabbed my arm. The footsteps circled the tent. They didn't run. They didn't try to open the flap. They just circled. Once, then twice, then silence. I stayed awake the whole night, too afraid to sleep. Every sound, every gust of wind, felt like a threat. The rain stopped sometime around midnight, but the clouds kept the moon hidden. I couldn't see anything out the mesh. It was just black. Finally, around 5 in the morning, I heard voices. 2 of them. I didn't move right away, too scared it might be a trick. But when I heard my mom's cough, I knew it was them. I unzipped the flap and ran out. They looked exhausted, soaked, and scraped up. My dad's shirt was ripped at the sleeve. My mom had a bloody scratch on her leg. They said they'd gotten lost. Missed a turn when the trail forked near the ridge. No signal, no markers. They'd spent the night in a lean-to made of branches and tried to get back as soon as it was light enough to see. I told them about the man, about how he'd stood there, about the footsteps. My dad's face darkened. He didn't say much. He just started packing up. We left within an hour. The drive home was quiet. None of us talked much. I think we were all trying to process what had happened in our own way. A few days later, my dad made a call to the local sheriff's office. They said they'd send someone out to check the area, but it didn't sound like they were taking it seriously. Just another story from the woods. I never found out who that man was. Maybe he was just some drifter living rough off the grid. Maybe he didn't mean any harm. But I remember the way he moved, the way he watched the tent, the way the woods went quiet when he was near. And I remember how it felt to be 12 years old, responsible for someone else's safety, and to know deep down that we'd been lucky. Nothing happened, but it could have. It so easily could have. Ever since then, I've never been able to relax fully on a camping trip. I still go sometimes, usually with friends, but I don't sleep as soundly. I don't turn my back to the woods, and I never, ever leave my tent unzipped. Because there are things out there, not monsters, not ghosts, just people. And sometimes that's worse. That trip was supposed to be simple. Just a long weekend in the woods with my daughter. Nothing elaborate, nothing wild. Just a quiet escape from work, phones, and the usual noise. I planned everything like I always do: tent, gear, food, maps, first aid, even backups for the backups. I don't consider myself paranoid, just prepared. I've camped since I was a kid. My daughter, Sadie, was 10 then, and I'd taken her on little camping trips before, but this was the first time we were doing a longer solo stretch, 3 nights deep in national forest land, away from the organized campgrounds, away from cell service, away from everything. She was excited in her own quiet way. She had her backpack packed a week early. She picked out her trail snacks. She asked if she could build the fire one night, and I told her she could. She's always been steady like that. She gets nervous, but she doesn't fall apart. She watches. She listens. I've always liked that about her. We left early on a Friday morning. The trailhead was about 5 hours from home, and then we had a 3-mile hike to the spot I'd picked out ahead of time. I'd been to that area once before with a friend about 5 years earlier, and I remembered it being quiet and clean with plenty of space to set up camp by a small creek that fed into a lake maybe a mile further out. No big animals, no high elevation, no tricky terrain. Just trees and space and quiet. That was what I was looking for. The hike in was easy. A little muddy in places from the rain earlier that week, but the air was cool, and Sadie didn't complain once. She asked if we'd see bears, and I told her probably not, but we kept the bear spray clipped on anyway. She asked me how far we'd be from other people, and I told her the truth. Probably a few miles at least. It made her pause, but she didn't say anything, just nodded. I think she liked the idea more than she let on. By early afternoon, we had camp set up. Tent on a flat patch under the trees, food hung, fire ring cleaned out. The creek ran 30 feet away, shallow and clear. I boiled water while Sadie explored the area around camp. She found a piece of wood shaped like a bird and held onto it like it was treasure. That first night was calm. We ate freeze-dried pasta and sat by the fire. I let her throw in sticks and make sparks with the flint. She asked if she could sleep with the rainfly open so she could see the stars, and I said yes. The sky was clear, and the air was dry. We lay in our sleeping bags and looked up through the mesh. She fell asleep first. I followed a while later, listening to the sound of the creek and the wind in the trees. The next day we hiked to the lake, spent a couple hours on the shore skipping stones and having lunch on a log. No other hikers, no footprints, nothing to make me think anyone else had been around. The trail was narrow but easy to follow. The woods felt still, quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your own breath sound loud. Sadie liked it though. She said it felt like we were the only people in the world. Back at camp that evening, she built the fire just like I showed her. I made dinner. She asked me about the stars, about how far they were. I told her the best I could, though I'm no expert. We stayed up until almost 10 that night. It was one of those moments you file away and hope you never forget. That night, though, something changed. I woke up around 2 a.m. I'm a light sleeper in the woods, always have been. I thought I heard something, not loud, but just enough to snap me out of sleep. It sounded like a branch snapping, maybe 30 or 40 feet away. Not an animal moving through brush, more deliberate, more human. I stayed still. I listened. Nothing. Just wind again. I figured it was probably just a limb falling or a raccoon, but I didn't fall back asleep for a while. The next morning, Sadie got up happy, full of energy, asked for oatmeal and dried apples. I made coffee and tried not to think too much about the sound from the night before. I kept telling myself it was nothing. That day we stayed near camp. I let her whittle sticks with her little pocket knife. We cleaned up the trail around our tent and skipped rocks in the creek. She found tracks in the mud. Maybe deer, maybe something else, and we tried to follow them for a bit. They disappeared into the thicker brush. That night, after we ate and turned in, I stayed up a little longer, just sitting by the fire alone. I didn't hear anything strange, didn't see anything unusual, but something felt off, just slightly, like the woods were watching us. I know how that sounds, but I've spent enough time out there to know the difference between my own nerves and that low, crawling instinct that says something's not quite right. We went to bed. Rain fly on this time because the temperature had dropped. I kept the bear spray right next to me, as always. Again, I woke up in the middle of the night. This time it was definitely footsteps. Not animal. Slow. Steady. Crunch, crunch, pause. Crunch again. They came from the direction of the creek. I could feel Sadie's small shape next to me, curled up tight in her sleeping bag. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. The footsteps stopped maybe 20 feet from the tent. Then nothing. Just the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. I waited. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Still nothing. Eventually, I unzipped the sleeping bag just enough to reach for the flashlight. I turned it on low and shined it through the mesh at the side of the tent facing the creek. Nothing, but the feeling didn't leave me. That cold, tight feeling in my chest. In the morning, I found footprints. Real ones. Human ones. Not mine. Not Sadie's. Bigger than either of us. Pressed into the soft ground between the tent and the creek. They weren't there the day before. I didn't tell her. I didn't want to scare her. I told her we were heading back early because I wanted to beat the rain that was coming. She didn't question it. She just helped pack up, quiet and obedient like always. We hiked out. I kept her close. I didn't let her fall behind. The whole way back, I kept checking over my shoulder, listening hard. Nothing. Not a sound. But that didn't make me feel any better. When we reached the car, I locked the doors the second we got in. I started the engine and didn't look back. We drove straight home. Later that night, I sat in the garage and looked at the pictures I'd taken of the prints. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a hunter, maybe another hiker who passed by and got turned around. But it didn't make sense. There was no reason for someone to be out there that late, moving slow near our camp. No reason at all. A week later, I read a post online from a guy who'd camped in the same forest, maybe 10 miles south of where we were. He mentioned finding signs of someone watching his camp. Small things moved, food missing, quiet footsteps at night. No one else ever saw anything. No one ever caught anyone. But more than a few had the same experience. That low-level fear, that creeping awareness that someone was nearby, just beyond the firelight. I never told Sadie the truth. Not the full truth. She remembers that trip as a cold one, the one where we had to leave early because of rain. I let her keep it that way, but I still think about it. About how easily things could have gone differently. About how being prepared isn't always enough. You can have gear and training and instincts, but sometimes all that stands between safety and something else is luck. And I think about whoever it was out there, walking toward our tent in the dark. Not a bear, not a ghost, just a man. A real man with real feet and real thoughts, and for whatever reason, he decided to come close. Close enough to listen, close enough to see us. And then, for reasons I'll never know, he decided not to come any closer. I never went back to that part of the forest again. I still take Sadie camping sometimes, but never that far off trail. Never that isolated. I watch the map, I watch the shadows, and I always sleep light, because now I know what it feels like when someone's just beyond the trees. And I know they don't always stay there. I never thought I'd find myself in a situation like that. When I think back to it, it feels like something out of a movie. But I was there. It happened. And I learned more than I ever wanted to about being a parent, being a man, and just how quickly a peaceful camping trip can turn into something else entirely. It started off like any other camping trip I'd ever taken. I'd been taking my kids out into the woods for years. Nothing too serious, just weekend trips to places that weren't too far from home. We'd go on easy hikes, set up the tent, cook simple meals over the fire, and just enjoy being away from everything. This time, though, was a little different. I wanted to give my daughter, Sarah, and my son, Ethan, a real taste of the wilderness. Something a little more off the beaten path, where we wouldn't be disturbed by other campers. I wanted it to feel like an adventure, but not so risky that I'd regret it. We left on a Friday afternoon, just as the weather started to cool, the kind of crisp autumn air that feels like the world's just holding its breath. It was supposed to be a simple trip to a secluded campsite about 10 miles deep into a national forest. No cell service, no other people, just us and the trees. I had the whole weekend planned out. An easy hike in, some time at the lake, fishing, cooking, all the usual stuff. Ethan and Sarah were excited, as they always were. Ethan was 12, full of energy and the kind of kid who'd be climbing trees and looking for animals to track. While Sarah, 15, was quieter, more introspective, but always up for anything. They both had their backpacks filled with what they thought they'd need for the trip: flashlights, snacks, small knives, and Sarah had even packed her journal. She was the type who liked to write things down, which always made me proud. I wanted to make this trip something they'd remember, something special. We got to the trailhead around mid-afternoon. There weren't many cars in the parking lot, which didn't surprise me. It was early fall, so most people were already gearing up for hunting season. I'd chosen this spot specifically for that reason. Fewer people meant more solitude. The trail was an easy one, nothing too steep, but long enough to feel like we were really getting away from civilization. As we hiked in, the kids were talking excitedly. Ethan was telling me about all the things he wanted to explore, and Sarah was looking around, soaking everything in, the way she always did. She'd occasionally stop and sketch something in her journal, a flower or a tree, or just the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves. I didn't mind. I was happy she had her own way of experiencing nature. By the time we reached the campsite, it was starting to get dark, but we still had enough light to set up the tent and gather some wood for the fire. The site was perfect, flat ground with plenty of trees around for cover. A small creek ran nearby, which was always a bonus. I made sure everything was set up before we started the fire. Ethan and Sarah took turns gathering small branches, while I worked on getting a proper fire going. It didn't take long. Once the fire was crackling, we roasted marshmallows, made hot dogs, and talked about nothing in particular. The stars started to come out, and I remember thinking how peaceful it was, how simple. The kids seemed happy. It was one of those rare moments where everything felt right. I woke up a few hours later to a strange sound. It was so quiet that at first, I wasn't sure I'd heard anything at all. But then I heard it again. A soft rustling, almost like someone was moving around near the tent. I sat up in my sleeping bag, straining to hear. Nothing. Then another rustle. This time it sounded closer. I froze. At first I thought it was a deer or maybe a raccoon, but it didn't sound quite right. There was a weight to it, like something heavier was moving around outside. It wasn't the usual light, skittering sound of small animals. This was deliberate. I held my breath, listening. I didn't want to wake the kids. They were both deep in sleep. I could hear Sarah's soft breathing and Ethan's occasional snore. I grabbed the flashlight from the side pocket of my pack, flicking it on quietly. I shined it through the mesh of the tent, but I didn't see anything. Just the trees and the dark shapes of rocks. My mind started running through possibilities. Could it be a bear? The sound wasn't right for that. A bear would have been more clumsy, more obvious. I turned the flashlight off, letting my eyes adjust to the dark. I listened again. The rustling was still there, faint, but it was real. Someone or something was moving around the campsite. I waited. I didn't want to overreact, but at the same time, I couldn't ignore the instinct gnawing at the back of my mind. I decided to take a risk and unzip the tent just enough to peek outside. My heart was pounding now, every little noise amplified in the stillness. There, in the distance, I saw a shadow. It was human-shaped. I froze, not sure if I was seeing things. My first thought was that it was someone else camping nearby, but there was no other tent around, no campfire. Whoever it was, they were moving slowly, deliberately, like they knew exactly what they were doing. My stomach churned. I had no idea who they were, but I had a feeling they weren't lost hikers. There was something about the way they moved, too smooth, too cautious. I didn't wake the kids. I knew better than that. I could tell they wouldn't be able to help in this situation. I didn't even want to risk drawing attention to the fact that we were here. I slowly reached for the bear spray and kept my eyes on the figure outside. I wasn't sure if they could see me, but I wasn't taking any chances. The figure stopped moving for a moment, then began walking again, this time closer to the tent. I gripped the spray tightly. I could feel my pulse in my ears, and every nerve in my body was telling me to either confront this person or run. But I didn't want to risk scaring the kids or making a wrong move. After what felt like forever, the figure stopped right by the edge of the campsite, no more than 15 feet from the tent. For what seemed like hours, everything was silent. The air felt thicker, like it was holding its breath. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow retreated, disappearing back into the dark woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. My mind kept replaying what had just happened. Who were they? What did they want? Were they just lost, or were they watching us for some other reason? When morning came, I decided it was best to leave. I didn't tell Sarah and Ethan exactly why, but I could see they sensed something was off. I packed up camp as quickly as I could, and we left without delay, hiking back the way we'd come. On the way out, we passed the spot where I'd seen the figure the night before. Nothing. No sign of anything out of the ordinary. But my gut told me that we'd been lucky. Whoever that person was, they hadn't meant any harm, or at least they hadn't acted on whatever thoughts they had. I couldn't shake the feeling, though, that if they'd wanted to, they could have done something far worse. As we reached the trailhead, I felt a mix of relief and lingering unease. I didn't say anything more about the incident to the kids. They'd never know the real reason why we left so suddenly. But I'll never forget that feeling of being watched, of knowing there was someone out there in the dark, just beyond the firelight. Later, I thought back to that ski trip my dad and I had taken years ago, how we'd shouted to the tent we passed, thinking it was just someone camping. How we'd heard the rustling inside and thought nothing of it at the time. The difference was, when we shouted, we didn't have to wonder if we'd just walked too close to something we shouldn't have. We didn't have to question whether we'd come too close to danger. But now I knew. I knew what it felt like to have someone watching you in the dark. And more importantly, I knew how quickly things could go wrong. I never went back to that spot. Not because I was scared, but because I couldn't forget the feeling of that person being out there, and the thought of what might have happened if they hadn't decided to leave us alone. We went camping again, sure, but we never camped that far out again. I learned that some places are best left alone, and some risks aren't worth taking, no matter how good the view or how peaceful the night seems. And that's something I'll never forget. The air was crisp, the night colder than I had anticipated when I left home. The campsite I had chosen was deep in the woods, secluded, far enough from the nearest trailhead that I knew I'd be the only one there. The drive had been long, but I'd managed to get to the site with plenty of time before sunset. It was my first solo camping trip in years. Life had been busy, and I felt it was time to reconnect with nature, to find some peace. At least that was the plan. Setting up camp didn't take long. Just my tent, a small fire pit, and a few logs to sit on. It was going to be a simple night. I planned to read a book, cook some dinner, and maybe, if I was feeling adventurous, take a quick walk around the area before bed. I didn't mind the solitude. In fact, I relished it. The sound of the crackling fire was the only thing that broke the silence of the forest around me. The distant rustling of the wind in the trees added to the sense of tranquility that I had hoped for when I planned the trip. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the woods seemed to come alive with the sounds of night creatures, distant howls, the chirping of crickets, and the occasional rustle of something larger moving through the underbrush. I was used to these sounds from previous trips, but tonight felt different. Something in the air felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the unease crept in. Maybe it was because I was alone. Maybe because I hadn't been in the wilderness for so long. I shrugged off the feeling and turned my attention to the fire. The warmth from the flames was comforting, and I tried to focus on the peacefulness around me. But just as the darkness grew deeper, I heard something, footsteps. Not the light padding of small animals, but the unmistakable, heavy crunch of boots on the ground. I tensed. It wasn't unusual for hikers to pass through, but it was getting late, and the woods were not exactly a popular place after dark. I had no idea who would be out there at this hour, and for a moment, I wondered if someone had gotten lost. I stood up slowly and moved to the edge of the campsite, keeping my eyes trained on the direction where the sounds were coming from. I couldn't see anything, just the blackness of the forest stretching out before me. The footsteps stopped, and then I heard voices, muffled at first, but getting louder. Two men talking to each other. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but something about this wasn't right. The forest was too quiet, too remote, for random hikers to be out here at this hour. My mind started racing, and I instinctively reached for the small handgun I kept in my bag. I'd never had to use it, and I didn't ever want to, but I always felt more comfortable knowing it was there. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The men's voices grew clearer now. I could hear one of them coughing, a raspy, painful-sounding cough that seemed to echo through the quiet woods. Then, there was more movement, the sound of boots crunching through the leaves. The last thing I needed was an encounter with strangers out here. A minute later, I saw them, two figures stumbling out of the trees. They were older men, maybe in their late 50s or early 60s. They didn't look like typical campers. Their clothes were worn, their faces drawn and tired. The one who had been coughing was bent over, holding his side, as if struggling to catch his breath. The other man, slightly taller, was supporting him. His face was tight with concern. For a moment, I hesitated. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to just retreat into my tent, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. They looked harmless enough, but the situation was strange, and the feeling of unease hadn't left me. I stood still, watching them approach. They didn't seem aggressive, but there was an awkwardness about their movements, a sort of slow, deliberate pace that made me cautious. As they got closer, the coughing man finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "We're lost, sir. Could you help us? We were just looking for a place to rest." I didn't answer right away. The last thing I wanted was to invite strangers into my camp. But something in his voice made me pause. It wasn't a typical begging or pleading tone. It was the voice of someone who had been through a tough time, someone who was worn out, physically and emotionally. I gave them a nod but didn't immediately offer any words. The taller man, who seemed to be the one leading, looked at me, noticing the gun at my side. He paused but didn't seem alarmed. If anything, he seemed relieved. I could tell that they were in a rough state, and I could see the older man's hands shaking slightly as he leaned on his friend. "I don't know if we can make it back to the trailhead tonight," the taller man said. "We've been out here for days. My friend here, he's not doing too well." I felt a pang of guilt. As much as I wanted to be cautious, I also knew that I couldn't just turn them away. They were clearly in trouble. The man's labored breathing and the look in his eyes said everything. This wasn't a chance encounter. These men were stranded. I didn't offer them food or water at first. Instead, I asked them to sit by the fire where they could warm up. I kept a close eye on them, though. There was no telling what might have happened to them out here in the wild, and I wasn't about to put myself in danger, even though I felt some sympathy for their situation. They settled down, the older man coughing intermittently, trying to catch his breath. I kept my distance, only moving closer when I felt comfortable. The taller man seemed grateful but uneasy. His eyes flicked nervously around the campsite. I could tell he wasn't sure how to act in this situation either, but he didn't want to make his friend any more uncomfortable than he already was. The air around us was heavy, thick with tension. As the minutes passed, I could tell that the older man was getting weaker. His breathing became more erratic, and his face had taken on a sickly pallor. His friend seemed to notice this, and I could see the worry creeping into his eyes. "Do you think he'll be okay?" the taller man asked, his voice tight with concern. "We've been out here for too long. He needs help." I knew then that I couldn't let them stay. Even though they had seemed harmless, I wasn't equipped to handle a medical emergency. And the longer they stayed, the greater the chance that something could go wrong. I'd had enough of these situations in the past to know that when things get tense in the wilderness, they can escalate quickly. I offered to walk them out to the nearest road, about a couple of miles away, but the older man's condition had deteriorated. The man's coughing fit had worsened, and his skin had turned pale. His friend looked panicked, and I could see the fear in his eyes. I knew I had to act fast. We made our way out of the campsite slowly, the older man leaning heavily on his friend as we walked. I kept my gun close but didn't make any sudden movements. I couldn't help but wonder what kind of trouble these men had been through, but I was more focused on getting them to safety. The thought of leaving them out here was unbearable. Eventually, we reached the road. I could see headlights in the distance, signaling the presence of other vehicles. We flagged down a car, and the driver stopped. The men didn't speak much, but their faces relaxed slightly when the driver agreed to take them to the nearest hospital. I didn't feel any relief until they were safely in the car and driving away. The encounter had been strange, unsettling even, but in the end, I had helped two people who had needed it. I never found out exactly what happened to them, whether they were just lost hikers or had been in some other kind of trouble, but I knew that the night had been a close call. As I sat back down by the fire, I reflected on the events that had unfolded. The feeling of unease had never completely left me, but the truth was, I didn't regret helping them. In the end, I had done what anyone would have done in my shoes. I had offered my help, and as I stared into the dying embers of the fire, I realized that some encounters in life are just that: strange, unexpected, and unsettling. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do what we can to help when it's needed. I never went camping alone after that, but I always carry the lesson with me. You never know who you might run into or what kind of help they might need.